In a time when conflicts in the Middle East seem eternal, and when the word dialogue has lost strength amid polarization, rediscovering Buber is like finding a hidden spring in the desert. He did not deny the wounds of history. On the contrary, he knew firsthand about European anti-Semitism, the trauma of the diaspora, and the fear that lived in the Jewish heart. But he also knew something deeper, a possibility of encounter that went beyond hatred, politics, and revenge. Martin Buber believed it was possible to create a shared home between Jews and Arabs, a home based on mutual respect, equality, and coexistence. A radical idea for his time, and perhaps even more radical today. He did not want a state divided by walls, but a society shaped by bridges, a community where the other was not an enemy, but a partner. This vision, which he called a binational state, was born from his most intimate philosophy, the relationship between the I and the thou. For Buber, everything begins in how we relate to the other, not as an object to be used or feared, but as a human being to be recognized. But his proposal met resistance. Many called it naive, others called it betrayal. Time passed. The State of Israel was founded. The conflict with the Palestinians intensified, and Buber's vision was pushed into the dusty corners of history. Still, it did not die. In moments of crisis, some return to it. Some ask, did we lose something precious by forgetting it? This video is an invitation to rediscover Martin Buber, to understand his life, his philosophy, and above all, his hope. Perhaps it is exactly what we need now. In the next chapter, we will get to know better this man who walked between worlds, from Europe to Jerusalem, from tradition to the future, always carrying with him the faith in encounter. Vienna, 1878. The capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire buzzed with the contradictions of a transforming era. On the elegant streets of the Ringstrasse, the assimilated Jewish bourgeoisie celebrated the fruits of emancipation, while in poorer neighborhoods, traditional families kept alive the flames of an ancient culture. It was in this crucible of tensions that Martin Mordecai Buber was born on February 8th, carrying in his name the perfect synthesis of two worlds, the modern, European Martin and the ancestral, Jewish Mordecai. The early years of his life were marked by a rupture that would forever shape his understanding of human relationships. When he was only 3, his parents separated, a traumatic event that led him to live with his paternal grandparents in Lemberg, Galicia. There, in the house of Solomon Buber, one of the most respected Jewish scholars of the time, young Martin discovered a universe that few of his generation would know, the deep and rich world of Hasidic tradition. Solomon Buber was not only a loving grandfather, he was a bridge between eras. A rigorous scholar of the Midrash and a deep connoisseur of Jewish literature, he introduced his grandson to the spiritual treasures of a people who had resisted centuries of persecution through the strength of their stories, teachings, and prayers whispered in the silence of the night. On long winter afternoons, while the snow covered Lemberg streets, old Solomon narrated to the boy the legends of the great Hasidic masters, men who found the sacred in the everyday, who saw in every human gesture an opportunity to encounter the divine. But grandmother Adele brought another flavor to the boy's education. A cultured and open-minded woman, she ensured Martin was also exposed to German literature, Enlightenment ideas, and the philosophical thinking that stirred Europe. It was as if the Buber household were a laboratory where tradition and modernity experimented with a coexistence that was not always harmonious but always fertile. At 14, Martin returned to live with his father in Vienna, carrying this dual heritage that would accompany him throughout his life. The Austrian capital of the 1890s was an extraordinary place for an intellectually curious young man. Freud was developing his revolutionary theories about the unconscious. Herzl was beginning to dream of a Jewish state. Artists like Gustav Klimt were breaking traditional aesthetic conventions. It was an era of creative effervescence, but also of growing political tension. At university, Buber immersed himself in studies of philosophy, art, and literature, showing early on a rare ability to navigate different intellectual worlds. He studied in Vienna, Leipzig, Zurich, and Berlin, absorbing ideas from thinkers like Kant, Nietzsche, and Dilthey. But it was the encounter with the writings of Ahad Ha'am that changed the course of his intellectual life. Ahad Ha'am, the pseudonym of Asher Ginsberg, proposed a different vision of emerging Zionism. While Theodor Herzl focused on the creation of a Jewish state as a solution to European anti-Semitism, Ahad Ha'am defended what he called cultural Zionism, the idea that the land of Israel should be, above all, a spiritual and cultural center that would renew the Jewish soul. This vision deeply resonated with the young Buber, who saw in the proposal a synthesis between the tradition inherited from his grandparents and the modernity he embraced at university. In 1901, at age 23, Buber married Paula Winkler, a German Catholic writer who converted to Judaism. The marriage itself was a statement, two people from different origins meeting in love and building a new identity together. Paula became not only his life companion, but also his intellectual partner, translating Hasidic works and contributing to her husband's work. Buber's early writings reflected this search for synthesis. He dedicated himself to rescuing and reinterpreting Hasidic traditions, seeing them not as relics of the past but as living sources of spiritual wisdom. His anthologies of Hasidic tales, Tales of the Hasidim, and Legends of the Baal Shem were not mere exercises in nostalgia, but attempts to show how those ancient masters had found ways to live an authentic spirituality amid the world's hardships. But young Buber was not only interested in looking back. The early years of the 20th century brought events that shook the European Jewish conscience: pogroms in Russia, the Dreyfus Affair in France, the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe. All this created a sense of urgency among Jewish intellectuals. Answers were needed. Alternatives had to be built. Herzl's political Zionism offered a practical answer: the creation of a Jewish state where Jews could live with security and dignity. But Buber, influenced by Ahad Ha'am, sensed the issue was more complex. It was not enough to create a state. It was necessary to think about what kind of society one wanted to build. It was not enough to seek security. Authenticity had to be sought. This concern intensified when Buber began to closely observe the developments in Palestine. The first Zionist pioneers were arriving in the Holy Land, buying land, establishing agricultural colonies, laying the foundations of what would become the State of Israel. But what caught the young philosopher's attention most was the question that few were asking: how would these new inhabitants relate to those who were already there? The Arab population of Palestine was not a technical detail to be resolved, but a fundamental aspect of any future project. Buber began to sense that the true test of Zionism would not be its ability to create Jewish institutions, but its capacity to build a society where Jews and Arabs could coexist in a dignified and mutually enriching way. These reflections crystallized during the First World War, when Buber saw how exaggerated nationalism could destroy entire societies. The war that devastated Europe between 1914 and 1918 was not just a military conflict but a spiritual tragedy that showed where the logic of domination, the objectification of the other, and the treatment of human beings as obstacles to be removed could lead. It was in this context of crisis and reflection that Buber began to develop the ideas that would make him famous. He realized that behind great political conflicts there was a more fundamental question: how do human beings relate to one another? Is it possible to find ways of living together based on mutual recognition, respect, on what he began to call the genuine encounter? These questions were not merely academic for Buber. They sprang from his personal experience, the trauma of his parents' separation, the richness of living with his grandparents, his interreligious marriage to Paula, and his observation of the growing tensions in Europe. And it was precisely this combination of lived experience and philosophical reflection that would give rise to his most influential work, a small book that would revolutionize the understanding of what it means to be human in relation to other human beings. In 1923, when Martin Buber published Ich und Du, I and Thou, he did not imagine he was launching one of the most revolutionary works of modern philosophy. The book was thin, just over 100 pages, but its impact would be immense. Written in poetic prose that felt more like a song than an academic treatise, I and Thou proposed a completely new way of understanding human existence. The work was born from a simple yet profound intuition. There are two fundamental ways in which we relate to the world. We can relate to things, people, and even God as objects to be known, used, manipulated. This is the I-it relationship. Or we can relate as subjects who recognize the other's subjectivity, establishing a genuine encounter. This is the I-thou relationship. For Buber, these were not merely philosophical categories, but descriptions of lived experiences that we all know, even if we lack the words to describe them. Who has never felt the difference between a mechanical conversation, where words are exchanged without real connection, and an authentic dialogue, where something genuine happens between people? Who has never noticed the difference between looking at a landscape as a hurried tourist and truly contemplating it with presence? The fundamental distinction was not in the objects of the relation, but in the quality of the relation itself. The same person could be found as thou in one moment and treated as it the next. It was not about judging one attitude as good and the other as bad, but recognizing that both are part of human life. We need the I-it relation to function in the world, where to work, study, organize our practical lives. But it is in the I-thou relation that we find meaning, fullness, what truly makes us human. Buber illustrated this difference with examples that touched everyday experience. Imagine a doctor examining a patient. He can treat them as a clinical case, a set of symptoms to be diagnosed and cured, an I-it relation necessary for competent medical practice. But he can also, in the same medical act, recognize the patient as a person with fears, hopes, a unique story, thus establishing an I-thou relation that does not negate the first but complements and humanizes it. The same applied to a teacher before their students, a parent before their children, a leader before their community. In each situation, it was possible to choose between the cold efficiency of objectification and the fertile risk of genuine encounter. Buber did not romanticize this choice. He knew it was not always possible or even desirable to establish I-thou relations. But he warned of the danger of a life dominated exclusively by the logic of I-it. Modern society, Buber observed, was becoming increasingly dominated by this objectifying logic. Industrialization, bureaucratization, growing specialization, all conspired to transform human beings into functions, resources, statistical numbers. Not that Buber was against technical progress, but he perceived that something essential was being lost: the capacity for encounter, mutual recognition, authentic presence. This analysis naturally extended to the religious sphere, a territory Buber knew intimately from his days with his grandfather Solomon. For him, authentic religious experience was, par excellence, an I-thou encounter, not with an object of knowledge or devotion, but with a living presence revealed in the very act of meeting. God was not something possessed through dogmas or rituals, but someone met in the total openness of oneself to the mystery of the other. This understanding revolutionized traditional Jewish theology, but also deeply dialogued with it. Buber found in the Hasidic traditions he studied in youth a rich source of examples of people living this religiosity of encounter. The great Hasidic masters were not abstract theologians, but men who found the sacred in genuine relations with other human beings, in loving attention to the everyday world, in the capacity to be present where life placed them. But Buber's work was not limited to the religious sphere. His philosophy of encounter had profound implications for understanding education, art, politics, all dimensions of human experience. In education, for example, Buber criticized both traditional authoritarianism and modern laissez-faire, proposing a pedagogy based on genuine encounter between educator and student, a relationship where both mutually transform each other without anyone manipulating anyone else. In art, Buber saw the possibility of privileged encounters with forms, colors, sounds that speak to us not as aesthetic objects to be analyzed, but as presences that summon a total response from our being. The authentic artist does not reproduce the world, but establishes with it an I-thou relation that he then shares with others through his work. These ideas found immediate resonance among some of the main thinkers of the time. Emmanuel Levinas, in France, developed an ethical philosophy based on the encounter with the face of the other. Gabriel Marcel explored the existential dimensions of interpersonal encounter. Even Christian theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer found in Buber inspiration to rethink religious experience. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Buberian philosophy was its application to the political sphere. If the essence of human life is the I-thou encounter, then any social organization must be judged by its capacity to facilitate or hinder these genuine encounters. Systems that reduce people to functions, that organize society as an efficient machine where everyone has their predetermined place, that prevent authentic dialogue between different groups, all such systems, regardless of their technical efficiency, impoverish human experience. This perspective led Buber to develop a critique of both capitalism and authoritarian socialism. Both systems, in his view, organized society according to the logic of I-it, reducing people to producers and consumers or to cogs in a state machine. Buber dreamed of social organizations that preserved space for genuine encounter, small communities where people knew each other personally, cooperatives based on mutual aid, decentralized federations respecting local autonomy. These ideas did not remain on paper only. During the 1920s and 1930s, Buber actively engaged with social renewal movements, supporting cooperative experiments, intentional communities, alternative forms of education. He believed it was possible, even within modern society, to create islands of genuine encounter where people could experience more authentic relations. But it was when Buber turned his attention to the Jewish question that his philosophy of encounter faced its most difficult and significant test. If it was true that the essence of human life lay in the I-thou encounter, what did that mean for building a Jewish society in Palestine? How to apply these principles in a situation where two peoples claimed the same land, where ethnic tensions grew daily, where the logic of force seemed the only language understood by all sides? These questions were not merely theoretical for Buber. As the situation in Europe worsened, as Nazi anti-Semitism intensified, as emigration to Palestine became not only an option but a survival necessity, Buber realized it was time to test in practice the ideas he had developed in books. The philosophy of encounter would have to face the ruthless harshness of political reality. The decision to leave Germany was not easy for Martin Buber. At 60 years old in 1938, he was an established intellectual with a solid academic career and an international reputation. But the winds blowing across Europe made any illusion about the future of Jews on the continent impossible. The Nuremberg laws had stripped German Jews of their basic rights, synagogues burned on Kristallnacht, and even respected intellectuals like Buber felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Emigration to Palestine, however, represented more than an escape. For Buber, it was a unique opportunity to participate in a historic experiment, the reconstruction of Jewish life in its ancestral land. But not just any reconstruction. He dreamed of creating a society founded on the principles of genuine encounter he had developed in his philosophy. When the ship carrying Martin and Paula Buber docked at the port of Haifa in March 1938, the philosopher contemplated a land in full transformation. The Palestine of the 1930s brimmed with the energy of Zionist pioneers. Tel Aviv grew like a mushroom, its white Bauhaus style, houses contrasting with the traditional Arab buildings of Jaffa. Kibbutzim spread through the valleys, turning swamps into green fields. Hebrew, a language dead for centuries, was resurrected in the voices of children playing on Jerusalem's streets. But Buber, with his trained eye to see beyond appearances, perceived the tensions brewing beneath the surface of this creative effervescence. The Arab population of Palestine, still about 2/3 of the total, watched with growing apprehension the massive arrival of Jewish immigrants. What to the Jews represented a return to the ancestral land, to the Arabs meant invasion and threat to their traditional way of life. The first weeks in Jerusalem were revealing for Buber. Settled in a modest house in the Talbieh neighborhood, he began to explore the city that would be his home for the next 27 years. Jerusalem was not just a city, it was a symbol, a dream turned to stone, a place where three great religious traditions met and often clashed. Walking through the narrow streets of the old city, Buber observed the complex human tapestry that made up Jerusalem. Orthodox Jews in black kaftans walked alongside Arabs in their traditional robes. Armenian merchants negotiated with Christian pilgrims coming from Europe. British officials in tropical uniforms tried to maintain order in a city that seemed to resist any attempt at simple classification. It was in this context that Buber took his position at the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. The university, founded in 1925, represented one of the most ambitious dreams of cultural Zionism: to create a center of academic excellence where Jewish culture could flourish in dialogue with world thought. Buber was appointed professor of social philosophy, a chair that would allow him to develop his ideas about community and interpersonal encounter. His first classes attracted students from different backgrounds. There were young pioneers from kibbutzim, intellectual refugees from Europe, some Arab Christians, and even British Mandate officials interested in better understanding the society they administered. Buber saw in this diversity a unique opportunity to put into practice his pedagogy of encounter. But it was outside the university that Buber made his most significant discoveries. He began to establish contacts with Arab leaders, intellectuals, religious figures, people who could help him understand the perspective of the other side. These conversations were revealing and often disturbing. Buber discovered that many educated Arabs did not necessarily oppose the Jewish presence in Palestine. Some even recognized the benefits that Jewish immigration brought: economic development, modernization of agriculture, creation of educational and health institutions. But they feared being marginalized in their own land, losing their cultural identity, seeing their traditions and way of life disappear under the impact of accelerated modernization. These concerns deeply touched Buber. He realized that behind the political conflict, there was a more fundamental question. Was it possible for two peoples to share the same land without one dominating the other? Was it possible to build a society where different cultures not only coexisted, but enriched each other mutually? At the same time, Buber observed with growing concern certain trends within the Zionist movement itself. Many Zionist leaders seemed to consider the Arab population as a technical obstacle to be circumvented, not as potential partners in building a new society. The language of force began to replace the language of dialogue. The dream of return to the ancestral land was, in the eyes of some, turning into a territorial conquest enterprise. These observations intensified during the Arab Revolt of 1936-1939, which broke out shortly before Buber's arrival in Palestine. The conflict, which pitted Palestinian Arabs against British authorities and Jewish settlers, revealed the depth of ethnic tensions in the region. Attacks and counterattacks followed each other in a spiral of violence that seemed endless. Buber saw in this violence the confirmation of his worst fears. When people begin to see each other as existential threats, when fear replaces curiosity, when the logic of domination prevails over the possibility of encounter, then philosophy becomes irrelevant and brute force dictates the rules of the game. But it was precisely in this context of growing polarization that Buber began to articulate his boldest response to the conflict. If the situation seemed to require choosing a side, Zionist or Arab, Jewish or Palestinian, Buber proposed a third way. What if it were possible to transcend this binary logic? What if Jews and Arabs could build together a society based on equality of rights and mutual respect? The idea did not come out of nowhere. Buber had studied historical experiences of interethnic coexistence and had observed how different communities managed to live peacefully when there were political structures that respected diversity. He began to imagine Palestine not as a Jewish or Arab state, but as a land where both peoples could realize their national aspirations without denying the aspirations of the other. These reflections gained urgency with the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The news coming from Europe was increasingly terrible. Ghettos, deportations, massacres. The Jewish community in Palestine mobilized to receive refugees who managed to escape the Nazi hell. But this mobilization also intensified tensions with the Arab population, who saw the massive immigration as an even greater threat to their survival as a people. Buber realized that a perfect storm was forming. On one side, the urgency to save European Jews demanded accelerating immigration and building Jewish institutions in Palestine. On the other side, this same acceleration fueled Arab fears and made any peaceful coexistence project more difficult. It was in this complex and tension-filled context that Buber began developing his most controversial and visionary proposal, the idea of a binational state in Palestine. It was not just a political solution, but the practical application of his philosophy of encounter to the reality of ethnic conflict. If it was true that the essence of human life lay in mutual recognition between different subjectivities, then it was possible to imagine a political organization that institutionalized that recognition, transforming ethnic difference from a source of conflict into a source of mutual enrichment. Martin Buber's proposal for a binational state in Palestine was born from a deep conviction. It was not necessary to choose between the fulfillment of Jewish national aspirations and respect for the rights of the Arab population. It was possible and necessary to find a third way that honored both legitimacies without sacrificing either. In 1942, at the height of World War II, as news of the Holocaust began to filter into Palestine, Buber helped found the Ehud Association, Union in Hebrew. The group brought together Jewish intellectuals who shared the vision that the solution to the conflict was not separation, but integration based on equality of rights and mutual respect. The binational proposal was not the result of naive idealism, but a realistic analysis of the situation. Buber observed that both Jews and Arabs had deep historical roots in the land of Palestine. The Jews could claim an ancestral connection going back thousands of years, kept alive through religion, culture, and collective memory. Palestinian Arabs, in turn, had lived in the land for many generations, developing their own culture and a deep attachment to the territory they considered their home. Ignoring any of these legitimacies would be not only unjust, but politically unsustainable. The attempt to create an exclusively Jewish state would inevitably marginalize the Arab population, creating a permanent source of conflict. On the other hand, denying the Jews the right to rebuild their national life in the ancestral land would be equally problematic, especially considering the tragedy unfolding in Europe. The binational solution proposed by Buber was based on some fundamental principles. First, full political equality between Jews and Arabs, regardless of demographic proportions. This meant that even if one group became the numerical majority, it could not politically dominate the other. Second, cultural autonomy for both groups, allowing each to develop its own national identity within a shared political framework. Third, economic cooperation based on complementarity, where the different skills and resources of each group would combine for mutual benefit. Buber imagined creative political structures that institutionalized this equality, a bicameral parliament where Jews and Arabs had equal representation, regardless of population numbers, a shared executive, alternating the presidency between the two communities, a judiciary that incorporated both modern law and the legal traditions of both peoples, local federations that allowed different degrees of cultural autonomy according to the specific needs of each region. The model was not completely utopian. Buber had studied historical examples of successful multicultural societies. Switzerland had managed to create a stable federation uniting different linguistic and religious groups. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, despite its problems, had demonstrated for decades that it was possible to govern a complex multi-ethnic society. Even in Ottoman Palestine, there had been periods of relative peaceful coexistence between different communities. But Buber went beyond historical examples. His proposal was based on a specific philosophical understanding of the nature of ethnic conflicts. For him, these conflicts were neither inevitable nor natural, but the result of political structures forcing different groups to compete for scarce resources or dominant status. By changing these structures, it would be possible to transform ethnic difference from a source of conflict into a source of creativity and mutual enrichment. Economic cooperation occupied a central place in Buber's vision. He observed that Jews and Arabs in Palestine possessed complementary skills. Jewish immigrants brought capital, technology, scientific knowledge, and international connections. The Arab population had deep knowledge of local conditions, agricultural experience adapted to the Mediterranean climate, and traditional trade networks that extended throughout the Middle East. Instead of destructively competing for markets and resources, Buber proposed that these competencies be combined. Mixed agricultural cooperatives could merge Jewish technology with traditional Arab knowledge. Binational enterprises could leverage both Western and Eastern markets. Shared educational institutions could train a new generation capable of fluently navigating between different cultures. Buber saw concrete examples of this potential cooperation already taking place, even amid rising tensions. There were Jewish doctors treating Arab patients, Arab merchants selling products to Jewish settlements, intellectuals from both groups engaging in academic dialogues. These genuine encounters proved that coexistence was not only possible, but was already happening wherever authoritarian political structures did not interfere. The binational proposal also included an ambitious regional dimension. Buber imagined that a successful binational Palestine could serve as a model for the entire Middle East. The region was undergoing profound transformations: the end of Ottoman rule, the rise of Arab nationalisms, the discovery of oil, and growing Western influence. Instead of fragmenting the region into homogeneous nation-states that would inevitably come into conflict, it would be possible to create multicultural federations that respected the ethnic and religious diversity of the Middle East. This regional vision was not only geopolitical, but also cultural and spiritual. Buber saw the Middle East as the cradle of the three great monotheistic traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A binational Palestine could become a laboratory for interreligious dialogue, a place where different spiritual traditions would meet not to fight, but to mutually enrich each other. But Buber was not naive about the difficulties of implementing this vision. He knew it would face resistance from both sides of the conflict. Many Zionists considered the binational proposal a betrayal of the dream of an independent Jewish state. After centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust, the idea of sharing political power with another group seemed unacceptably risky. On the other hand, many Arab leaders rejected any proposal that recognized Jewish national rights in Palestine. To them, Zionism was a colonial movement that had to be resisted until complete expulsion. The idea of political equality with the settlers seemed an unacceptable legitimization of the Zionist invasion. Buber understood these resistances, but believed they stemmed from fear and mutual distrust, feelings that could be overcome through genuine dialogue and practical experience of cooperation. He proposed that the transition to a binational state be gradual, starting with local pilot cooperation projects, progressively expanding to regional structures, and finally, to a national federation. The experience of the kibbutzim offered an interesting model. These collective communities had demonstrated that it was possible to create alternative forms of social organization based on cooperation and equality. Buber envisioned binational kibbutzim, where Jews and Arabs would work together, share resources, and raise their children in a multicultural environment. Some experiments in this direction were already happening. There were agricultural cooperatives where Jews and Arabs collaborated, irrigation projects benefiting both communities, schools where children from different backgrounds studied together, hospitals that treated patients regardless of ethnicity or religion. These examples proved that cooperation was not only possible, but advantageous for all involved. Buber also proposed specific structures to institutionalize intercommunity dialogue, binational local councils to resolve conflicts and plan joint development, universities where Jewish and Arab students would study not only together, but also about each other's traditions, cultural centers that would promote artistic and intellectual exchange, mediation courts that would resolve disputes through dialogue instead of legal imposition. The proposal also included mechanisms to protect minorities within each national group. Orthodox and secular Jews, Christian and Muslim Arabs, Bedouins and peasants, all would have the right to cultural autonomy within their respective national communities. Binational federalism would be complemented by internal pluralism that respected diversity within diversity. This complex and multifaceted vision of the binational state represented more than a political solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It was the practical application of Buber's philosophy of the I-thou encounter to the political sphere, the attempt to create social structures that facilitated mutual recognition between different human groups. Fundamentally, it was an experiment to test whether humanity could transcend the tribal logic of domination and build more mature forms of collective coexistence. If you enjoyed learning about this deep and little-known vision of Martin Buber, don't forget to leave your like down below. It really helps the channel grow and bring these ideas to more people. If you're not subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and turn on the bell to receive all updates about philosophy, Israeli history, and topics that make us reflect on the world and peace. And of course, share this video with your friends and family. The more people understand this message of dialogue and respect, the closer we'll be to a better future. Thank you for watching until here. See you in the next video.